My psychiatric experience is a big part of my expertise in the subject matter of my poems, my experience in hospital, my ambivalent relationship to my medication, etc. But I'm going to start with two poems about my parents, because everything does start with our forebears. So the first one is called For My Father, and it was written in a workshop with the poet Carol Langell in Nova Scotia. For my father. When you were just a boy, the smallest and fastest to chase the pig bladder ball down the dust-covered streets of Changchun, you saw the ones who had died of starvation, swollen and ragged in those same streets, their ghosts drifting like dust to join their ancestors at the temple. But you didn't believe in ghosts. You believed in Mao and the men who followed him up and down the mountains as you ran from the Japanese into the dust-colored hills. You were hungry and hungry for knowledge. Your belly was empty, but your head was full of beautiful things. Equations describing the universe, a swirl of dust, how a radio works. Later, you wanted architecture but settled for physics, spoke loudly in order to sound tall, and married an English girl who kept a dusty house. You're still making sacrifices, not like the firstborn son you are, precious as an egg. You bow in the dust, make me finish the rice, try to pay for everything, as if you haven't already, as if the years you spent working off the debt of your future, the dust of your past, were not enough. The next one is called In the Beginning, and it's the first poem, at least I think it will be the first poem in my memoir, which will be a poetry and prose, hopefully. Excuse me. It's really hot here. In the beginning. There is a plain, snow-covered, rimmed in the distance with curling barbed wire. That's where I come from. Not my father's Guangdong village, nor my mother's English one. They might never have met if they each hadn't packed their bags for the future and left. But they did on a cheap trip to Paris, my mother trudging through mono. Was it always like that for her in their marriage, a kind of kissing disease that made her sick and sleepy, wishing she were somewhere else? Before I came into being, she typed his thesis, bound in yellow, and became his wife. My father dreamed of suns, Expo 67, man and his world. My mother dreamed of New Zealand, daffodils, and another life. Canada, the future, was cold and lonely for her and backward half a century ago. I was trudging across a snow-covered plain, a refugee from whatever terror my own mind held. I took shelter in her womb and was born with the cord that gave me life in a stranglehold around my neck. The next one is a poem about Antigonish, which is a small university town in Nova Scotia, not about the town, but about my experience of madness that led me there, I guess, and what happened there. Antigonish. When I went to Antigonish on the bus the first time, it was pouring rain, and madness trickled out of my eyes, wild and bulging like a fish on the dock. They let me phone a cab at the library. I went to see a room too far from town where I knew I'd drown in all that oxygen. On the way home, 3 hours on the bus, I felt myself falling into myself, a terrifying disambiguation. I thought my disease was lit up like a marquee or a taxidermied salmon, flashing like a mirror ball, surrounded by vanity lighting. When I moved to Antigonish, I dragged that heavy trophy with me and nailed it to the bathroom wall, so every time I brushed my teeth, I saw it staring back at me. When I came home, I left it there. Sometimes I miss it, but I know I have the skill to reproduce it in paint by number on black velvet. So I went to Antigonish to try to escape to recover from a mental health crisis, and I brought my madness with me, and I thought I left it behind, but I clearly didn't, because I'm still mad. The next two poems are from my chapbook, my old chapbook called Mental Illness Poems, which is backwards in the Zoom view. It's called Human. I'm angry, I'm loud, I'm hyper, I'm manic, I'm obnoxious, troublesome, dangerous, delusional. I'm tired now, I'm hurting. So many injuries don't pierce the skin, but accumulate like dust in our corners, those awkward places. In TQ, there are no corners. The wall curves to meet the floor. I slide down them like paint, and every pain ricochets like a pinball. I'm human, I remind myself. No matter how battered my brain becomes, how ragged, I cup it in my hands like a grasshopper, long legs flickering, ready to leap. And I know I have a few friends on here who might not know what TQ is. It's therapeutic quiet, which is neither therapeutic nor quiet. Oftentimes, it's a like solitary confinement in the psychiatric hospital. That's my considered opinion. The next one is called Medication Time. It's about lining up for medication when you're an inpatient in the hospital. Sort of happens at this little half door to a medication room. Everyone lines up and gets their little cup of meds and swallows it or not, depending on how they feel about them. Somewhere there is a great hole where all our happiness is buried. We walk the streets in cloaks of fog, puddle-soaked and dreamless. Our umbrellas close weakly over us, a broken thing. We look for the sun's ragged spot in the sky, but it's endless cloud upon cloud. Inside us is the tap turned off, the dark drip into a tin can, that's all. There's nothing to be done but get in line and wait for the latest dispensation. Little circles, ovals, oblongs, bitter as dandelions. I'm not sure what my time is like, but I have a few more to read, if that's okay.
You're good for time. It would be a pleasure to hear a few more.
Okay. This one is missing meds, also about my medication and about aripiprazole and sertraline, which are antipsychotic and antidepressant medications. So they were what I was taking when I wrote this poem. Missing meds. Wake, stretch, wash, prayers, breakfast, meds. That's how it's supposed to go. Instead, I tumble out of bed, have 2 cups of coffee, 1 for each eye, check my phone, then eat and shower and leave for the coffee shop to write poems. So often I forget the tiny flying saucer of aripiprazole that is meant to float across my twilight moodscape, hover over each wandering thought in its shrunken rowboat, abducting, then beaming it back to me, the cleaner, brighter, sober second version of myself. And then at night, when I am fallen from the perch of day, still dressed into my unmade bed, I often wonder if I took a sertraline, the little capsule that's half yellow and half white, like me, which should contain me calmly bobbing in the sea of dreams to be rescued in the morning by kindly alien hands. When am I not in transit, caught in the terrifying safety of well-meaning pharmacy? Only when I am errant, absent, missing from my meds. Only then by accident or laziness, because I also fear what lies outside the electric fence, the grassy freedom where the endless winds of madness blow. I just have 2 more. And this one is from my chapbook published by Gaspereau Press called Body Parts. And there are 4 poems about different parts of the body, and this one's called Throat. There are scars from where I cut myself, not deep and fine, not deep, fine like cracks on the screen of my cell phone. I know the hairdresser sees them and has been trained not to ask. I prefer it that way, of course, but I will tell you, they mean I hurt once and tried to hurt less. I failed at the time, but now they are surface only. A kind nurse tried to salve them away and left a fine tracery of cracks, not filled with gold, but new skin. The mind wants destruction, glorification, illumination, but the body accepts itself with a gentle infilling, making hills from furrows, a wave under skin, always cresting. And the last one is called Cliff. And it was first broadcast by the CBC, along with some paintings I did of this poem that now hang in the Healthy Minds Cooperative offices. Cliff. I like my madness. It keeps me sane when the world walks backwards off a cliff while taking a selfie. I like it when I tell people I'm mad and you can see they don't know what to say and are a little afraid. Not because I'm in favor of promoting fear, especially fear of madness, but because I like it when people don't know what to say. Not that it makes them listen any better. In fact, I can see them closing like oysters all around me. No, it's because then I can say whatever I want as they shut up and shut down and back away. So I wave and shout over that same cliff, the one at the edge of what it means to be human. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for not only bringing us into kind of your mind's experience of madness, but also very specific places in which that's experienced, which I think is an important part of it as well, and how those places shape our experiences. With that, I will stop sharing so that Sarah can share.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Great.
Gotcha.
So I'd like to begin by thanking Miriam for organizing today's event. I've attended Cross-Pollinations for a few years now, so it's an honor to be invited to speak today. And I'd also like to thank Anna for sharing her captivating poetry, which really encapsulates the kind of creative work that I analyze in my Mad Studies research, as offering us kind of complex and nuanced understandings of madness. So for anyone unfamiliar with Anna's prose, I'd also recommend her novels Low and Migration Songs. They're great, as well as her poetry. I would also like to start by recognizing my own positionality as a white settler scholar. I currently live in London, Ontario, a settler city built around the Deshkan-Zibi on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Luna-Pewauk, and Adirondack peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Samba Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. The current local nations to London, Ontario include the Oneida Nation, the Munsee-Delaware Nation, the Chippewa of the Thames, and the Six Nations of the Grand River. It's also relevant to note that, like Anna, I am also a mental health user-refuser, which informs my academic research in Mad Studies. So my presentation today will focus on providing an introduction to the field of Mad Studies for audience members who might be interested in the possibilities found in the intersections between creative, academic, and medical discourse explored in the health humanities. I'll begin by introducing some key terminology and giving a brief introduction to the field of Mad Studies and some examples of the intersection specifically between madness and race. I'll then conclude with some examples from Anna's poetry as survivor or user-led research. The majority of this presentation will be drawing on my PhD dissertation, Critiquing Psychiatry, Narrating Trauma, Madness in 20th Century North American Literature and Film, which is publicly available, but I'm also happy to share that document or other readings if anyone in the audience is interested. So I'll begin with terminology just to ensure that everyone can follow along. Mental illness or mental disorder is likely the most well-known term because it is the biomedical label for psychiatric and/or mental difference. This is the language that psychiatrists and other health professionals will typically use, and as a result, this is often the language that becomes used in popular discourse as more appropriate or accurate than, let's say, pejorative terms like crazy or insane. Some mad studies scholars have critiqued this label because it implies that mental health is an entirely biological experience. So it's caused by genetics, neurotransmitter failure, chemical imbalances, etc., with an entirely biological, i.e. medical solution, such as psychopharmaceuticals, which discounts the impact of social, environmental, and political forces on mental health, such as trauma, abuse, and inequity. However, it's important to note that for many individuals, the term mental illness is their desired label based on their personal experiences. I'll also often use the term mental distress, which is an alternative for naming specific symptoms that might be categorized under the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, that it includes under the purview of mental illness, pathologizing human experiences. So for instance, instead of saying depression or anxiety, we might just say mental distress. When capitalized, madness is a critical term reclaimed by MAD studies as a positive identity marker rather than its previous pejorative label, akin to how queer has been reclaimed as a positive label despite its history as being used as an insult. So madness can mean different things to different people. For some individuals, they might prefer to identify as mad instead of, let's say, bipolar, because they do not feel that biomedical label accurately reflects their experience. Some individuals may never have been formally diagnosed, on purpose or not, but see themselves in this identity label. Not all mad scholars are also mad people. So identifying as mad does not necessarily mean that your experience of madness is entirely positive. Rather, madness as an identity label is meant to signal a different form of engagement or acceptance of mental difference than mental illness perhaps offers. People who identify as mad might also consider themselves to be a mental health user-refuser, which is an alternative term to patient that is meant to focus on the agency of individuals within the psychiatric system. While patient puts individuals into a passive relationship in their care, mental health user-refuser makes clear that mad individuals accessing care are often navigating complex systems and ideally making informed choices about the kind of care that they would like to receive. This may take the form of someone maybe accessing therapy, but not psychopharmaceuticals, or maybe they are using both, but in a way that feels right to them. Perhaps by only working with therapists that use certain methodologies or only using certain kinds of psychopharmaceuticals. So being a mental health user-refuser does not mean that the individual necessarily approves or supports all practices within psychiatry, such as involuntary hospitalization, nor does it mean that that individual is entirely anti-psychiatry. So again, this is an umbrella term like madness. It can mean many different things to different people. So finally, psychiatric survivor is a refusal term for a person who has experienced abuse in the psychiatric system. Most often, this term is used to describe a person who disputes their mental illness label imposed by an outside source. So these individuals do not necessarily regard themselves as mad, even in a positive or more holistic sense, and they see their experiences within the psychiatric system as fundamentally rooted in harm because of their lack of agency and autonomy. While certainly mad and or mental health users-refusers can also experience abuse in psychiatric systems, this label is often reserved for individuals who have undergone such a removal of agency and infliction of trauma that they have completely kind of lost trust in the psychiatric system to provide genuine care, and as a result often become very staunchly anti-psychiatry. So while these terms might seem contradictory, it's important to note that these labels, like all labels, are very limited in their capacity to speak to the fullness and complexity of human beings. So it's possible for individuals to identify with all these labels or none of them. I'm certainly not trying to advocate or promote any of these terms, but simply provide context for why they have been used. So another key term that I'll be using is saneism, which can be defined as oppression that makes normal the practice of discrimination, rejection, silencing, exclusion, low expectations, incarceration, and other forms of violence against people who are othered through mental illness diagnosis, history, or even suspicion. So central to my research is exploring how literature and cultural productions explore the impact of Satanism through art. So a lot of this language that I've just introduced arises out of mental health activism that gains a lot of traction in the 1980s and continues today. In North America, there arose grassroots activism by former patients protesting the inhumane conditions of psychiatric services, such as Mental Patients Liberation, which was later changed to the CSX, or Consumer Survivor Ex-Patient Movement. Meanwhile, in the United Kingdom, the psychiatric survivor and service user movements became platforms for human rights groups to protest their mistreatment and advocate for reform. Recently, the MAD movement emerged as an umbrella term meant to synthesize multiple anti-psychiatric grassroots organizations, along with contemporary associations such as Mad Pride Toronto, Resistance Against Psychiatry, the Coalition Against Psychiatric Assault, and the Mind Freedom Association. So some of the primary concerns of this activism was directed at psychiatric abuse in the 1980s and earlier, including physical, emotional, sexual, and spiritual abuse, and psychiatric paternalism, which leads to a lack of patient agency, most evidently seen in involuntary hospitalizations and/or treatments. So while many of these conditions have changed for the better, in part because of this activism, some scholars still challenge the extreme dichotomy of power relationships between psychiatrists and mental health users-refusers. For instance, Bergstresser critiques the competency assessments that allow psychiatrists to impose their own judgments on users-refusers to either limit or eliminate their autonomy. She considers the multiple ways in which mental health users-refusers' precarity is exploited to justify far-reaching paternalism that denies them even minimal agency once they've been involuntarily hospitalized. This is a quote from Bergstresser. Clothing and belongings are taken away. Inmates are cut off from friends and relatives, told when and where to sleep, when and what to eat, when to move or stay still. There's a complete loss of privacy. Inmates can be observed wherever they urinate, defecate, or shower. Bodies are forcibly subdued, events both experienced and witnessed. They are searched for contraband and pharmacologically sedated. Inmates are told that their opinions and thinking are actually symptoms or evidence of a lack of insight into their true damaged personhood, along with constant questioning of the validity of their own perceptions and judgment, unquote. So for Bergstresser, these examples highlight that mental health users-refusers can be denied any level of autonomy while institutionalized, and that their lives become ruled by psychiatric paternalism, which fundamentally undermines their bodily and mental autonomy by suggesting that they are incapable of having insight into their own experiences, which is why she advocates for a more balanced power relationship between mental health users-refusers and their care providers. So it's important to note that there's very much a spectrum within the MAD movement and MAD studies that kind of oscillates between two positions on how to respond to the realities of psychiatric abuse and paternalism that was prevalent in the 1980s and arguably continues today in some cases, often directed towards marginalized people such as women-coded, Black, Indigenous people of color, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, and two-spirit people. One view is anti-psychiatry, so the position that mental illness is fundamentally a social construct and that all psychiatric treatment is fundamentally unscientific and rooted in policing undesirable social identities and behaviors. The alternative view being that mental distress is real and requires compassionate care, but that psychiatry needs change and improvement in order to eliminate abuse and power imbalances and to restore individual autonomy when accessing care. So as a result, while it is convenient and in some ways helpful to think about the MAD movement as this kind of global initiative towards rethinking and changing mental health services, and it's important to understand that these various grassroots collectives are all emerging in a similar socio-political climate in Europe and North America in order to challenge the status quo within Western psychiatry. It's not really accurate to think of these activists as being a homogenous group with just one singular goal or philosophy. So built upon MAD movement activism, Mad studies is a burgeoning academic field that has its kind of theoretical roots in Foucauldian discourse analysis, disability or crip theory, post-structuralist feminism, critical race theory, and queer studies. The term Mad Studies is coined by Richard Ingram in 2008 at a disability studies conference, in which he defines Mad Studies as, quote, a project of inquiry, knowledge production, and political action devoted to the critique and transcendence of psi-centered ways of thinking, behaving, relating, and being. The three main areas in which I see Mad Studies kind of distinguishing itself from other related disciplines or methodologies, such as, for instance, psychoanalysis, would be one, that it challenges psychiatric authority and Satanism. So essentially then Mad Studies kind of calls into question any kind of discrimination against people with a mental health label and challenges psychiatric authority as the only kind of privileged perspective on mental health. Two, rather than privileging only psychiatrists, Mad Studies advocates for survivor and service user experiential knowledge and research to be centered and used in our understanding of mental distress and development of mental health services. Mad scholar Legayo argues that one form of psychiatric violence is the epistemic violence of disqualifying individuals with a psychiatric label as legitimate knowers at a structural level, thus undermining Mad knowledge to privilege psi knowledge as the only legitimate discourse of mental health. She suggests the inherent vulnerability of being a mental health user-refuser because their validity as knowers is undermined and they are constructed as incompetent and dangerous to further, quote, disqualify and deny the person's knowledge and ways of knowing, unquote. So Mad Studies then is kind of fundamentally rooted in challenging this kind of epistemic violence against Mad individuals. Finally, Mad Studies is often rooted in a more holistic approach to mental health that does not necessarily exclude the biological, but also takes into consideration social, political, and environmental factors, such as the impact of discrimination, like racism, on mental health, as well as structural inequalities, like food and housing insecurities as related to mental distress. So Mad Studies is an interdisciplinary field. So in terms of methodology, it can look quite different when it's being utilized in the social sciences compared to the humanities. The value that I see in a Mad Studies methodology for literary and cultural studies is how it can offer us an alternative ethical reading practice for texts written by Mad people, as well as unpack potentially harmful stereotypes embedded in cultural representations of madness, not rooted in lived experience. Literary and cultural productions can often be an accessible space for people otherwise silenced and marginalized in their experiences of trauma, abuse, and mental distress, both within and outside of psychiatric spaces. As a result, my research tends to focus on authors like Anna Quon, who utilize creative expression in order to unpack the lived experience of madness, as well as the realities of being a mental health user-refuser, which can often come with limitations that can instruct us on how to create more genuine spaces of care for people experiencing mental distress. Mad Studies scholars have described this methodology of close reading madness in literary and cultural texts as a Mad reading practice, as Mad woman theory, and in my own research, I use the term Mad Studies trauma-informed approach. So if you're interested in how you can engage with mental health literature without pathologizing or silencing either characters or authors, which replicates how Mad individuals can often be treated in society, you can engage with one of these methodologies that focuses on privileging the autonomy and knowledge of people with lived experience of madness that often exposes issues that can be obfuscated or made invisible within biomedical discourse of mental illness. So for instance, in my research, I have found that mental health literature and film by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color often critiques the manner in which mental health diagnoses are racialized, such that Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities become overrepresented and mistreated in psychiatric spaces. Some authors that I look at in my dissertation include Toni Morrison, Rowie Hage, and Leslie Marvin Silko. However, particularly as a white settler scholar, it's essential for me to be cognizant of how acknowledging the legitimate harms imposed by racism and settler colonialism could also problematically further pathologize and essentialize harms with BIPOC communities, further contributing to the problem. Altoian scholar Eve Tuck critiques what she terms damage-centered research, which, quote, documents pain or loss in an individual, community, or tribe because it can potentially lose its historical context to support a pathologizing approach in which the oppression singularly defines the community, even if the goal of the research is to obtain particular political or material gains, unquote. So as a result, it's imperative to both recognize how BIPOC communities are being pathologized through sanist discourse, while not essentializing this pathologization with the communities themselves. So for instance, Black scholars have engaged with MAD studies and disability studies in order to critique how constructions of sanity and insanity are fundamentally rooted in the project of white supremacy. Sammy Schilt critiques how disability studies has avoided issues of race and how able-mindedness functions to pathologize marginalized people such as African Americans with, quote, differing experiences of reality, unquote, to the sociocultural norm as being mentally ill. Along similar lines, Ashley Taylor argues that, quote, the specter of the disabled mind is deployed against those who fail to conform to the dominant gendered and racialized rules and behaviors and use as a way to bring dissenters back in line, unquote. Labels of mental illness, then, often function as markers of difference, particularly racial difference. Furthermore, Black scholar Lamar Jarrell Bruce articulates how the binary of sanity-insanity is fundamentally premised on white supremacist Enlightenment rhetoric, operating to justify slavery that associates Black freedom with, quote, crime, sin, stigma, liability, and sickness too, unquote, such as drapetomania, the mental illness coined by Samuel Cartwright in 1851 to describe the, quote, disease-causing N-words to run away, unquote. Consequently, mad Black feminist scholar Therese Pickens claims that, quote, within the United States cultural zeitgeist, there is no Blackness without madness, nor madness without Blackness, unquote. So by examining the intersections between anti-Black racism and Sanism, then, these authors critique how even seemingly race-neutral diagnoses can still be racialized. Because of this cultural historic legacy in North America and of the category of mental difference, madness, and or mental illness operating to further justify and reinforce white supremacy, particularly slavery, it's imperative then to re-examine how whiteness is constructed as the, quote, transcendental norm, the good, the innocent, the pure, and also the sane, while madness is its, quote, diametrical opposite, unquote. So for example, Jonathan Metzel's The Protest Psychosis unveils how in the 1960s, there is a turning point for the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia, which pathologized the political protest and anger of African-American people, predominantly Black men, during the civil rights movement as symptoms of schizophrenia, causing them to be dramatically overrepresented in mental health institutions. Significantly, this trend continues today, with MAD study scholars identifying how anti-Black sanism has led to an anti-Black crisis in mental health diagnosis and care, including that young Black men are diagnosed with schizophrenia more than any other group, and Black children are being psychiatrized at higher rates. So in the article that I recently published in Women's Studies, I problematized literary critics who have read 12-year-old Pecola Breedlove and Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye as schizophrenic, which ignores the fact that Pecola is utilizing distinctly childlike coping mechanisms to survive conditions of trauma. By depathologizing Pecola using a MAD studies trauma-informed approach, I suggest how we can restore her agency and girlhood. This is just one example of how utilizing a MAD studies methodology in literary and cultural criticism allows us to interpret characters and authors differently, and in turn avoid reinscribing anti-Black sanism in our analysis. So while I focus so far on anti-Black sanism, I want to also share some of the other intersectional work around madness that considers how classism, xenophobia, settler colonialism, queerphobia, and transphobia, among other modes of oppression, intersects with sanism. So for instance, Anne Anlin Cheng examines in The Melancholy of Race what she terms racial grief through a Freudian psychoanalysis methodology, and Anna theorizes that racial melancholia as a critical term for explaining the constitutive role that grief plays in racial and ethnic subject formation, paying particular attention to Asian American novels and lived experience. Freud defines melancholia as a pathological form of mourning and becoming psychologically stuck, which Chen argues mirrors the guilt and the denial of guilt, the blending of shame and omnipotence in the racial imaginary. Chen clarifies that she does not deploy psychoanalysis as a diagnostic tool and claims that, quote, this book hopes to begin a conversation about not why we can use psychoanalysis, but why we already do, because of the politics of race has always been spoken in the language of psychology, unquote. So significantly then, Chen engages with Freud to depathologize the concept of melancholy, to instead argue that it is constitutive to racialized subjectivity. So then along similar lines to Pickens, Chen argues that racial hierarchies are inherent within the current understandings of madness, such that racial subjectivity often becomes essentialized with madness, and racialized persons are often further othered through sanist rhetoric. Queer and trans scholars have also critiqued biomedical understandings of madness because of the historic inclusion of homosexuality in the DSM until 1973, and the ongoing inclusion of gender dysphoria disorder, which most trans individuals must be diagnosed with in order to access gender-affirming healthcare. So these examples are meant to speak to the ongoing need for intersectional analysis of madness, because admittedly, mad studies can often be a very white and Eurocentric scholarly field that has also been guilty of cultural appropriation and eliding the importance of intersectionality in the impact of Satanism. However, many mad studies scholars like myself are now actively focused on queering and transforming mad studies based on survivor and user-led research to become both an interdisciplinary and intersectional field, such as the Mad Knowledges in User-Led Research and the Routledge International Handbook of Critical Mental Health. So because of the historic privileging of white voices and white epistemologies within psychiatry, literary and cultural productions can often provide spaces for otherwise marginalized and silenced voices, including women-coded, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, and two-spirit, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color, to recount how they experience mental distress. Anna Quon's poetry and novels, including Migration Songs and Low, speaks to intersectional experiences with madness through fictional characters and allows the audience to engage with and understand a broader narrative beyond a biomedical one of the lived reality of mental distress in the socio-political context of Canada. So for instance, this quotation from Migration Songs speaks to how the failure of the Canadian dream, imagined as this space of multicultural acceptance, can lead to a kind of intergenerational trauma passed down to second and third generations that impacts mental health. While not specifically a mental health narrative, the novel nevertheless speaks to a broader context of how immigrants living in Canada subjected to racism and xenophobia, despite efforts to feel at home, will nevertheless experience unhappiness as if it is a genetic trait in this huge, empty country. So as a result, it's imperative that we consider how madness is socially and culturally situated, because as individuals, we cannot disentangle how feelings of unhappiness or mental distress can be sourced in biological, familial, and social wounds. Her poem Cliff is also a helpful reminder of how reclaiming madness as an identity label can often make people feel uncomfortable, but how this discomfort is part of its intention in order to destabilize the binary of sanity-insanity that is often invoked to pathologize and silence individuals as being potentially dangerous. But this cliff or this boundary between sanity and insanity is not unique to people with mental health labels, but fundamentally part of what it means to be human. While her other poetry, like Missing Meds 2, also speaks to how psychopharmaceuticals can perhaps produce a cleaner, brighter, sober second version, and speaks to a very individualized mental distress that can benefit from psychiatric care, Cliff addresses how saneism operates within the world and often ostracizes people with a mental health label who might ironically see their madness as keeping them sane because it speaks to their humanity. So in this way, I see Anna's poetry as speaking to both the lived reality of madness as producing mental distress that can interrupt our lives, but also how sanism and this fear of madness as inherently negative also speaks to societal limitations that continue to marginalize individuals and behaviors seen as deviant. Perhaps then, through embracing madness as the poem Cliff does, and eliminating the fear around madness, we can in turn create more equitable and anti-racist healthcare in social spaces. And I would encourage any healthcare providers to read poetry and prose by individuals with lived experience like Anna Quon for exactly that reason. So in summary, I hope the audience takes 3 main points away from my presentation today. Firstly, that Mad Studies seeks to challenge power imbalances in psychiatry in order to make it a more equitable space that offers accessible and informed care to empowered mental health users refusers. It also functions to challenge sanism within social discourse, such as stigma around mental illness that can cause barriers to equitable access, such as lack of affordable or safe housing. Secondly, that more research into intersectional madness is needed in order to continue to examine the ways in which women-coded, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, and two-spirit, and other marginalized communities may be overrepresented and mistreated within psychiatric spaces and discourse so that mental health care can become a racially and culturally safe space. And finally, that one way that we can achieve these goals is by turning to mad racialized authors like Anna Quon, who utilizes her own user-led experience to share how we might learn and engage with alternative narratives of madness outside of a strictly biomedical one, without neglecting the harsh realities of mental distress either. So through cross-pollination or interdisciplinary collaboration across the health humanities between poets and psychiatrists, my hope is that we can positively impact both social discourse and social services to become more inclusive and equitable spaces. So thanks so much for your attention. And again, to Miriam and Anna for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I learned so much, and I'm so jealous of your students at Huron who get to learn from you every week. That was amazing. And I love how you also brought in your own kind of analysis of Anna's work. It definitely makes me want to read her novels as well.